Hey there, welcome to Blockhead, the podcast where cartoonists talk comics and just about everything else. My name is Geoff Grogan. I'm a cartoonist, animator, and illustrator, and for the next hour or so, I'll be your host in a series of conversations with comics creators about their lives, their work, and comics. So sit back and enjoy. Hello, welcome back to Blockhead. Today, the second part of our two-part interview with Kevin Mutch, the cartoonist behind the wonderful, wonderful new book, The Moon Prince, which is available from Fantagraphics and wherever good books can be had. You will find it there. It is a terrific, terrific tale. A rollicking, fun adventure story featuring two children lost on the moon amongst friends and enemies in the style or manner of Jules Verne or Edgar Rice Burroughs or who else? The Harry Potter series, Frank Herbert. There's all kinds of great influences in there, but it's an entirely original tale. And it's a lot of fun. And it's a beautiful book, too. Beautiful to look at, beautiful to put on your shelves and in your library. So I highly encourage you to look for it. Kevin Mutch's The Moon Prince, available from Fantagraphics and wherever great comics are sold. So be on the lookout for it, okay? Today's opening is going to be probably a record breaker for the shortest opening maybe we've ever had on the show, because as you heard last time, I hurt my back, and I'm finding it a little more difficult than usual to sit upright and do this recording today. So I'm just going to keep it short and get right to it, okay? Here's part two of my interview with Kevin Mutch and myself in conversation. And I will see you on the flip side. Enjoy.
Because when people say, well, look, it can't even get the number of fingers right, or, it all looks the same, and I can always tell that it's AI. There's two things. One is it's a moving picture. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's like, a snapshot of something that's evolving incredibly quickly. Mm-hmm. And so the complaint about the fingers being wrong was true for a year.
Right.
It wasn't. Mm-hmm. And the candidness, anyway, the fact, the canned quality that they have, where it's like, oh, you can always tell it's just this style or that style, that's deliberate.
Yeah.
Like they're very carefully constraining these things. So something will get released and you'll be like experimenting with it. And again, I'm speaking here as somebody using it for business purposes in digital imaging. I want to make that clear, because I literally had to sign a contract stating that I was not using AI in my comics to get published.
Wow.
Yeah, that's where it's at.
Wow.
So I want to be careful about how I characterize this, because I'm familiar with this stuff professionally from digital imaging and very familiar with it.
Right.
And you'll see the new releases come out,
Yeah.
And a month later, even a couple of weeks later, they've throttled them back.
Oh, okay.
So there's all kinds of things that they could be doing, and when they briefly are available to you to try that with, then you start seeing like, holy shit, this is really idiosyncratic if you let it be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's not so much that it's canned as that they can it.
I get it. Yeah.
And that's what scares me.
Yeah, they're putting limitations on it right now that won't be there.
Yeah, and because they're afraid of like people losing their shit over this.
Yeah,
So they're trying to roll it out in such a way that we're like the frog in the pot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then all of a sudden one day we look around and we realize, wow, everyone's unemployed.
Yeah.
But they're kidding themselves if they don't think that this is going to lead to massive problems socially.
Yeah.
Because it is, and it will. Like it's not just people in fields like commercial illustration that are up in arms. It's people in fields like coding or young law students that graduate with a $500,000 in student loans,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and
Or
then they're finding out they can't even get an entry level position.
research scientists,
Yeah,
teachers, all kinds of professions can be impacted if it grows exponentially the way that it is suggested it will grow, as you're suggesting, it could grow very
yeah,
rapidly, in fact. No, the societal changes that could come from this are really kind of, I mean, it's unnerving because we don't know. It's certainly a technological change on the scale of industrialization, in a way. And so what happens as a result of that? I mean, and it's going to happen, I think, as you're suggesting, quite quickly. And I mean, at one point, nobody's going to be able to control it anymore, right? I mean,
yeah,
at some point, nobody's going to be able to control it. And when nobody
yeah.
can control it,
But that's really where the doom in doomer comes in.
yeah,
It's not even so much the massive unemployment, it's the what happens when you can't control it.
yeah, because it'll be generating of its own volition, it'll be generating whatever it needs to generate. We won't even be asking it anymore. It'll be doing it on its own.
Yeah,
And that's the I mean, that's the scary thing, because what role do we play in a world like that? I mean, all of a sudden we're all standing around, wondering where our next meal is going to come from. And AI is just generating all of this material, and we're all
yeah.
just, what do we do? Um, and it's not like it's going to lead to a leisure society. That's highly unlikely. It's more likely it's going to lead to enormous, dislocation, I think.
Yeah,
Anyway,
they like to the guys in tech, the tech bros,
yeah,
as they say,
yeah.
like to talk about what's the acronym they use? UBI,
Mm.
Universal Basic Income.
Okay,
So it's
that idea.
yeah. So the idea is, everyone will get a few $1,000s a month.
Socialism.
Yeah.
Socialism in America? Oh no.
Yeah. And I don't know. I mean, I'm just,
Yeah. No,
yet
I get
again, I
it.
find myself in the position of saying I'm glad to be able to say I can retire
Yeah.
because, and we have a house and we're okay. But I just think about all of these friends that I have,
Hmm.
especially uh, work friends and
Yeah.
clients.
Hmm.
People that I've been doing with for decades, and this last year, especially the last 6 months, has just been horrible
Oh my
for
gosh.
them.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think it's just a taste.
Well,
But
I agree with you. Yeah, I mean, there's so many things. This is far afield from why we came together today, which is the Moon Prince. Um,
yeah,
but and I hope the audience is still with us because I think this is really interesting and really pertinent. And your insights, I think, are really important because you've been in the midst of all of this for all these years. Um, it's interesting to think about, though, in the midst of not only the change technologically, but also the change socio-politically, for example, here in the United States. I mean, I'm assuming, without actually having talked to you about it much, but one of the reasons you guys left the United States was politics. Had to do with the political situation here and how untenable it's been for all these years, and how it seems to be just devolving as time goes on, becoming, worse.
well, I think that there's probably a global thing going on too,
Mhm. Mhm.
um, to do with inequality,
Yeah,
and a lot of that boils down to technology. I mean, if you
yeah,
ever read Thomas Piketty's book Capital, and he was talking about the moment in the 1980s when computers started to make it possible to need less white collar work. And there was suddenly this rupture between productivity
hmm
and wages.
hmm
And that is really when things started to go haywire in the West.
hmm
And I think that Yeah, I think that is what we're seeing. I think it's happening faster in some places than others.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's happening in Canada too,
Mm-hmm.
but Canada is like more like a Western European country in some ways.
Yes.
Um, Canada's sort of like halfway between France and the United States in
Mm-hmm.
terms of like how much of what percentage of its economy is being funded by taxes,
Mm-hmm.
for example, which is a good way to look at a country and say, what is this? Where is this culture at? You know,
Mm-hmm.
and in France, is like 50% of the economy is basically the various government sectors, various
Mm-hmm.
levels of that. In the States, it's somewhere in the 20s.
Mm-hmm.
And in Canada, it's like in the low 30s.
Mm-hmm.
And you feel the difference the minute you cross the border. It's like, oh, socialized medicine. No one pays. I had to go to the emergency room last week. Uh, Nothing, no, not a mention about insurance or money.
Say, we were in France in July, and I fell and hit my head on a stone wall,
Oh,
and yeah, it was bad. And I thought, honest to God, I thought I was going to die. And
oh,
so I'm like totally out of it. I'm taken to the hospital in an ambulance. Get to the hospital, go through all these tests, X-rays, the whole bit. I'm there for actually I walked in. There was nobody in front of me, no line in front of me. I was brought right in. There were three nurses who took care of me right away. I got to see the doctor within 15 minutes of being there. The doctor came out, he diagnosed me. He looked at the X-rays after the fact. We walked out and Deb said, "Okay, so who do I pay?" You know, pay? What are you talking about, pay? You don't have
yeah,
to. There's no unbelievable, we were just like totally blown away. You mean
yeah.
we had to pay for the ambulance because it was a private contractor, but which was no big deal. It was like $100, and so
Yeah,
you
and imagine what that would have been in the States,
oh
like a
my God,
thousand
yeah.
or more.
and
Yeah,
and in the ambulance I got lots of care in the ambulance. They
yeah,
things you need to do to make sure
yeah,
somebody's going to live. They were doing.
yeah.
It was an incredible experience. I mean, just to
Yeah.
realize, wow,
So
so
to
yeah,
so to to bring that back around to the moon prints,
yeah,
which
yeah, yeah.
I keep driving it off in these tangents, but just to bring that back to the moon prints, one of the things that I was writing about, especially when I first sat down to imagine like what sort of a world are these kids living in, was oligarchy.
Yes, absolutely.
And in the book, they're referred to as the aristocracy.
Hmm.
Um,
Yes.
but there's the character Mad Billy, for example,
Hmm.
who's like a kind of a revolutionary, and part of this, kind of underground resistance that's going on. And he talks about how these people live in their fancy gilded palaces, and they employ a kind of soma like drug
Hmm.
to
Yes.
keep the population in thrall
Yeah.
called joy juice, which is a nod to Al Cap and Little Abner, Kickapoo joy juice.
Oh
So
yeah.
they have this joy juice that they're using to keep the population in line.
Yeah.
And the idea is that, one day they're going to run out of that stuff and we'll be here, you know, ready to set things right. And
Yeah.
it really is like kind of framed as a little bit of a class struggle. But I was thinking at the time of the turn of the previous century.
Yes, when the accumulation of wealth in the 1%, 5%, whatever it was enormous, enormous.
Yeah,
Well, the rest of
yeah,
the population, and this went through. We're talking about the whole Gilded Age, right? Period.
right. Yeah,
Morgan. Yeah.
yeah. And so at the time that I was starting to write this stuff, like maybe 2010, there was already a fair bit of discussion about the fact that we were moving back in that direction.
Hmm.
Um, to just go back to the Piketty book a little bit about how that started probably in the mid 80s.
Hmm.
And you started to have growing inequality again. So I
Yeah.
was thinking about that a little bit as I was writing it,
Hmm.
thinking about the turn of the previous century and maybe that there was an echo now. But now it's 15 years later, and it's like way worse
Yes,
and
absolutely.
getting even worse or worse.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
and
I was reading the book, and the first part of the book, I don't know if she's the queen or whatever she's introduced, and all the whole idea of the aristocracy, and all I kept thinking was this, despite the fact that it's fantasy, this could be what happens. Like we think immediately it's the 19th century, kind of the past, an imagined past, but it could be the future. And it feels like it could be the future. This devolved society that's broken up into, the aristocracy and those without. It feels as though this, like Jules Verne imagined a future, this seems to be a possible future that we might fall into as well. The idea of and the kind of war that's going on,
yeah,
the police
yeah,
state that exists, all of that which you've got here, again, without overburdening the book with it. It's just the structure of the society these characters live in. But it certainly feels like we're looking at this now, in a way.
yeah. And I think one of the things that's happening too is this, I don't want to mention any specific politicians because I want to be able to cross the border and not get thrown in jail.
Yeah, or now have your visa denied or whatever.
Yeah. But somebody was talking about a particular American politician,
Mm-hmm.
and they were saying this particular American politician is not so much interested in being a dictator uh, as in being a king.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I thought, yeah, it's interesting to think about like the evolution that took place. Say, if you look at Putin in Russia,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and after the fall of communism, you had this rise of oligarchs.
Yes.
You might have had 20, 30 people who were really able to concentrate a lot of wealth.
Yeah.
And as long as they kept the country functioning in such a way that there was a reasonable chance of having a job and a reasonable chance of a decent life,
Mm-hmm.
people were okay with it.
Yeah.
But there was still like this enormous concentration of money and then power.
Yes.
And I was kind of thinking about that a little bit doing the moon prints. I was thinking about like there's a society where there's a lot of money being concentrated and it's gotten a group of people who have a lot of power. I think now in the States, it's moving even past oligarchy towards a kind of royalty. Although I'm still rooted enough in the 20th century, having grown up in it,
Mm-hmm.
that I imagine that the pendulum has to swing back at a certain point. But it's failed to do that already for a long time, and I keep finding myself proven wrong.
Well, none of our institutions are holding, I mean, you look at the Supreme Court. Supreme Court is just a lackey of the administration, and Congress the same. And what's scary, is that 41% of the people in the last poll still approve of what's going on, and what's going on is, literally people being kidnapped in the streets because of the color of their skin, you know
Yeah,
whomever seems to be of a certain skin color is somebody who is all of a sudden identified as an enemy, and
yeah,
uh,
yeah.
a criminal.
So to get back to your question about why leave the States,
Yeah,
and was it political?
yeah.
Um, there absolutely there was a political factor in it, but there was also just a kind of like pragmatic factor of where do you want to raise your
Mhm.
biracial kids?
Yeah.
And I don't mean to imply that I don't think the United States is a good place to be biracial or to raise kids or anything like that. But as a practical matter, we were living in a town in New Jersey
Mhm.
where if you didn't have to drive very far away from New York City before you'd start going into the diner, to have lunch and finding some very, very disturbing uh, pamphlets, things
Mhm.
like this.
Mhm.
And there was just this sense of like my wife grew up in the South,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
south of the Mason-Dixon line, and she has fed me uh, 30 years worth of very rich perspective on what that was like.
Mm-hmm.
And, we lived together in LA and New York, New Jersey. And those are liberal enclaves,
Mm-hmm.
which is, you know, ideal, I guess, if you're worrying about it from that angle. But when you start feeling like, as has, I think, been the case the last few years, when you start feeling like there's a backlash now taking place against immigration and on and on, um, you do start thinking about like where where do I want my kids growing up, and where do I think they'll have the best future?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean to imply that I don't think they could have had a good future in the States. I'm sure they could. But you just think, wow, here we are. I've got Canadian citizenship and we can move up there.
Yeah.
And it's other factors besides. I don't mean to suggest that that was like even a huge factor, but it wasn't not a factor.
Mm-hmm.
You got five or six things going on in your mind, and
Yeah.
okay, let's do that.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot to be said for uh, life here.
Yeah.
To be fair to the United States, there were reasons why I moved down there.
Sure.
And when I was a young man, and one of the reasons I moved down there was opportunity.
Yeah.
And there just isn't, it's changed now because it was 30 years later, but there wasn't a lot of opportunity to be a young artist in Canada and have any kind of, other than teaching.
Yeah.
And the problem for me was I was trying to teach, or, I went and did an MFA, um, and dreamt about teaching in the Canadian university system in the art schools.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but by that point, the art schools in Canada, most of which were established in the 60s, had gotten super saturated with Americans. All these
Ah,
Americans, a lot of them came up to dodge the draft, to get
yeah.
away from the Vietnam War.
Right.
So you'd be in a Canadian art school, but half your props would be American, of an age that you knew, like, oh, so you came up here in your early 20s when you finished college, you know.
Right. Sure.
So all the universities in Canada said, we need to like really have less of a mono-ethnic department here. Let's reflect the fact that we have a lot of women students.
Mm-hmm.
We have a lot of students from different backgrounds and
Mm-hmm.
ethnicities and complexions.
Mm-hmm.
So let's hire some people that reflect that.
Mm-hmm.
So as a practical matter, that meant that when I came onto the market with my master's degree, there were not going to be
Yeah.
too many jobs. There were literally advertisements for teaching jobs. This would be unheard of in the States, but there were literally advertisements for teaching jobs where they would say, white males, this is not directed to you.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, yeah,
Wow.
um, yeah. And I, 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 I thought to myself, fair enough,
Uh-huh.
you
Yeah.
know,
I
fair
get
enough. The
yeah.
department is 90% white males.
Yeah. Yeah.
But on a selfish level of like, I want to teach,
Sure.
and I want to have it, you can't help but think to yourself, is there a more sexist, racist country I can move to get away
Thus I became a teacher. Oh,
I did find, like, like there were paths available to me in the United States
yeah.
that now coming back to Canada, you know, it's Canada is like has a lot of balances.
Mhm.
Like Canada is a place where there's a lot of discussion around fairness.
Mm-hmm.
An American of a certain political persuasion might describe it as woke.
Hmm.
Um, but it's great. It's like it just feels like a place where people can talk about different issues without fear
Yeah.
of being shut down angrily.
Yeah.
It's less shouty.
Yeah.
Um, but could I have had the same opportunities had I stayed in Canada that I had down there? No, I know I wouldn't have.
Hmm.
And so I love the United States for that, and I'm grateful.
Hmm. Well, uh, as one who's lived here and really never lived anyplace else, I wonder if that's going to be the case in the future, for people, especially when you have a situation now where honestly, from this perspective, it's unclear how we're going to get out of the political situation as is now, and how unfriendly it is now to those coming to this country from elsewhere. Our tradition has always been, as an immigrant nation, at least, we have in many ways maybe never lived up to that promise, but have always tried to, at least in our better angels have always tried to. And now there's such anger and such resentment towards people coming from outside of the country. You wonder if those and also the situation we have now where there is an overt movement that's right out front, that's anti-education, that's anti um, science, that's anti-progress in so many ways. You wonder what kind of opportunities there's going to be, not only for people coming into the country from elsewhere, but also for upcoming generations uh, of people, because there seems to be a concerted effort to dumb down the population, to create an environment which they're not healthy to create, because the CDC, the Center for Disease Control,
Yeah,
being gutted.
yeah,
There needs to be concerted effort to create a situation in where there is a mass population that is fighting over scraps while the oligarchy live as they do. So the world that Max and Molly inhabit, in some ways becomes a reality, of some kind. And that's going far. It's a big stretch, but in, figuratively anyway, that seems to be what they're striving towards. So I don't know that that world of opportunity is going to last much longer, you know. I have a pretty negative vibe about, unless there's some kind of radical change. And there are a lot of people who are suggesting radical change. Unless there is, I don't have great optimism, for the future for this country anyway.
yeah. I don't know. I don't know what I would say back to that. That would be in any way more optimistic or positive. Like I agree with you. I mean, I think a lot of what we're seeing is the culmination of automation, and
Yeah.
I think automation allowed everyone to move up the ladder and move up the food chain and require education and require a kind of sophisticated culture where people were able to be fluid and mobile and get along with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Because, in a sense, capitalism needed that.
Mm-hmm.
It was you on the downside of looking at it, you could say, well, capitalism reduced us all to abstractions.
Yeah.
You know,
Interesting
so it's
point.
like I want to take this guy here out of his family that he would have traditionally been providing for in this embedded 19th century or earlier sense, where it's like, you are the father and here is your wife, and it's like, yeah, absolutely, that's sexist and it's a terrible stricture and it's conservative. But then capitalism comes along and automation comes along and says, we don't need people to be artisans
Mm-hmm.
working in their shop,
Mm-hmm.
making things by hand according to things that they've learned that are rich and full of tradition. What
Mm-hmm.
we need are essentially units,
Mm-hmm.
worker units that we can take from one place all across the country and plop them down.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're in New Jersey, we're going to move you to San Francisco to work in our plant over there making similar widgets
Mm-hmm.
because you can do that. You can be transplanted into that other location. So you get this kind of pop culture, popular culture, that's like it's a monoculture. It, differences get wiped away, and that's the height of modernism after the war. And it was able to sustain like a pretty great standard
Mm-hmm.
of living that people talk about nostalgically, and this is what MAGA is after,
Mm-hmm.
right? They think about that period after the war where it was like, the dad could have his factory job or whatever it was, and they could afford a house and they could have the kids, and
Mm-hmm.
the wife didn't have to work. So now they want trad wives and all of this because they think, well, that was easier and simpler and it worked for everyone. And that's what, a certain politician leading the country is after.
Well, he's after an illusion of that. I don't think they're after a reality of that, and because I don't think it's going to happen, you know.
Oh, and besides which, the nostalgia that they're thinking back for always excludes like what was it like to be anyone other than
Sure,
that one group that was able to pull it off.
yeah, it's true.
And
It really does, and that's a whole swath of the country that's left out of that narrative. It's interesting because I have the same nostalgia about that era. Um, it's it my parents. I lived in upstate New York, here in upstate New York, um, in a I would say a very self-sustaining um place within the state. We had industry, we had jobs, well-paying jobs. There was upward mobility. If you were educated, and an education then didn't require an MBA or a master's degree. It was just actually you could do well with a high school diploma, but my dad got a bachelor's degree from a small local college, also a local college, which was not a state university at the time, because it was just being built then. So it was still a small local college. But in this environment, they did have that society. My parents were able to survive on one salary, um, and we had a nice home. We had a safe environment to grow up, very stable environment to grow up in. And in a lot of ways, it was very satisfactory. I mean, it was great. Of course, again, this is to say it was a very provincial situation. It was completely, in a lot of ways, so, as I said, self-sustaining, but it was cut off from the rest of the world. A lot of the things that were happening throughout this United States, this place was insulated from, because it had an economy of its own.
yeah,
Um, but that was tenuous, and we didn't realize how tenuous that was, because in the late 70s, early 80s, the major corporation that drove this area, which had been founded here, IBM, which had been founded in this area, left. And it
yeah,
moved for all the reasons that corporations moved outside of the United States. It did that.
yeah.
It eviscerated this environment. So it's never recovered. In 50 years since that happened, it's never recovered, and it's been gutted ever since. There have been attempts to revive the economy and whatnot, but they don't succeed. Um, and that bubble that existed then was broken. It was broken and it's never come back. And so you can see why people here um, are resentful, people who remember that, because they had it once and they don't have it now. Where did it go? Why hasn't it come back? It's got to be those people's fault. It's got to be the fault of immigrants. It's got to be the fault of people who are the other. It's always pointing to somebody else's fault instead of pointing to, well, technology forces we can't control, but also the oligarchy, the idea of trickle down economics, and all of those ideas which contributed really massively. Deregulation, all of those kinds of things open the door to this devastation, really, of an economic model. And that economic model, I think, certainly could have adapted survived, shifting ideas about patriarchy, shifting ideas about, the role of gender in the household, those kinds of roles that even my parents were struggling against. My mother struggled against that her whole life. The idea that she was a housewife. She was too smart for that. She was just like, I'm not accepting this. This is not what I want to be or what I believe in. I don't think I'm limited to this. That was a very important part of who my mother was. She pushed against that her whole life. Um, I think that economic model could have survived those kinds of changes and even changes in demographic. But what, in terms of, racial demographic and all of those kinds of things, immigration and all those things, it could have survived that if there hadn't been this movement, both technologically and also philosophically, I think, of the overlords of the economy, to all of a sudden just dispense with all of that and move away, in the name of amassing enormous amounts of wealth to the detriment of localities elsewhere. And so, the resentment I've seen that resentment build up in my own environment here, but those people in power have pointed to, others for the rationale, for the reason for that economic devastation. And so you get all these MAGA people who are like resentful and filled with hatred, and you understand to some degree why they're filled with all of those. I mean, the median income in the 1960s was the medium. If the minimum wage had kept pace with inflation, from the 60s to now, the minimum wage wouldn't be $7.50 an hour, which it is now. It'd be like $66 an hour. You know,
Yeah.
their income just hasn't kept pace. Well, why is that? It has nothing to do with immigration. It has nothing to do with, the other people that you might want to point to as being the root cause. It has to do with the fact that these, you know, bastards at the levels of power that control all of these things, have made it so, and they've made it so, through a variety of institutions and structures that they've implemented since the 1980s. Um, and it's terrible. It's terrible to see this environment that I live in here is never, I can't ever see it coming back to what it was, the place that it was when I grew up. And I feel fortunate, and also guilty, that I grew up in an environment like that. But I think it could have survived changes in, as I said, those changes, so those sociological changes, I think it could have survived if economically, um, those people in power hadn't been about, robbing the foundation out from under it, economically and elsewhere. Sorry to go
I
on
mean,
about that.
personally, I kind of take like a fatalist
Hmm.
uh, attitude towards this. I described myself earlier as a doomer, but I'm a bit of a fatalist in the economic sense, where I just think there's like no, not much to be gained by saying, well, these people are greedy,
Yeah.
because of course they are,
Yeah. Hmm.
you know? And I mean, I think that I don't know what the answer is in terms of what's coming down the pike really rapidly to do with technological change
Hmm.
and throwing people out of work today
Hmm.
faster than they were getting thrown out of work 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, when we started to have the Rust Belt and we started to have offshoring,
Hmm.
and we had the collapse of that post-war economy that had a kind of arrangement with everyone in the working class and the middle class.
Hmm.
I don't know what the answer would be to that as it unfolds today so quickly,
Yeah.
other than, I mean, if you've ever read Frank Herbert's Dune,
Yep.
and you recall that there are no computers of any real
Yeah.
complexity,
Right.
and that artificial intelligence is not just illegal,
Yeah.
but literally, there's kind of like a religious
Yeah.
uh, structure in place that makes it blasphemous.
Yeah.
I think it's something along the lines of "Thou shalt not suffer a machine to think in, you know, the
Yes.
ways of a human," something like that. And they called it the war that took place against that, the Butlerian Jihad.
Yes. Butler and Jihad. Yes.
Yeah. I don't think that that's actually possible. I
Yeah.
don't think that we could have that. But I do think that that's about the only thing that could stop what's happening.
Well, I'll tell you, more and more, people talk about this rupture, at least in this country, this rupture between the coast and the coastal elite, as it were, and the center of the country. And I find it interesting, actually, this is a side issue, but I find it interesting that this administration and the Republicans in general, the whole MAGA movement, is anti-education, has tried to dismantle universities, and it's gone after their curriculum, under the guise of disabling DEI, which is pernicious enough. They're going through and challenging curricula. Um, it's interesting that most people you find of the educated class read the New York Times and lean towards the liberal side of things. And you have to think to yourself, well, they're doing this for a reason. They're dismantling education so that people don't begin to read about these things and don't engage these ideas and don't understand or don't analyze, what's happening to the world, to enable them to continue, to rely on tropes that the powerful have relied on for as long as human beings have existed. And the idea, again, that somebody else is responsible for your problems, not the structure of society, and certainly not the people in power. But as to what could possibly happen right now, it doesn't look very good. And you have here uh, a society wherein obviously people are being kidnapped off the streets and troops are being sent to cities. Whether they've taken over the capital, and they've sent troops to Los Angeles, and they talk about sending them to Chicago, and all of this is in the dialogue. Well, then you have governors of certain states that are standing up against that. And then you have people from red states who are, from the South, sending their troops to support the troops that are in DC and in Los Angeles or whatever. And you begin to realize that schism is already happening, that idea, this notion of, and I hate to use the term, but it's out there, civil war is already underway, that in some sense it's already happening. It's happening ideologically. It's only a matter of time before it happens, physically, in whether that means in terms of gunfire or it means people being protesting and being beaten up, you know. It's already happening. And in some sense, I think about for a moment, I think about the 60s and I think about the civil rights era and I think about John Lewis, right? And I think about John Lewis getting his head cracked in, for
Yeah.
protesting and that kind of force and that kind of thing, in some sense, that was a moment, really. That was a moment of civil war in a way, you know. And adjustments were made. And of course, never lived up to, but a struggle in the direction of the light, always a struggle in the direction of the light. And at this point, to struggle, it seems as though that struggle has reasserted itself and become more dramatically identified, Um, and we're at a precipice in a way. And a precipice will what's going to happen? Well, it seems as though there are strong indications of what's going to happen. Um,
Well, it feels very much like we're edging into a science fiction dystopia. Like
yeah,
that's the territory. Like if you were to go back in time 10 years and say to your younger self, uh, here's a sketch of like where the United States and the rest of the world will be in 10 years, you might have found that really kind of hard to swallow because, I mean, it just has like these science fictional elements, AI not least of all,
Yeah.
but politically, economically, uh, and just the rate of the pace of change
Yes.
being so crazy.
Yes.
And I mean, I just did this book where it's like, it's all about something unfolding gradually over centuries. They're recovering from uh, essentially the collapse of a solar empire,
Mm-hmm.
and it's obviously meant to be Rome.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and to the extent even that you've got characters speaking Latin,
Yes.
and
Right.
they call it Solarian. But
Yes.
I don't feel like at a point, there was one point where I kind of, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, would have said, oh, this book in the end turned out to be kind of timely.
Yes.
Like there's this kind of timeliness to it. And now I'm not even sure if that's even appropriate to think about because the things are changing so fast
Yeah.
that I think to be timely, it would have to be a book that was about things changing in a bewilderingly fast way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, yes, it is, to bring it back to the Moon Prince, I mean, it is timely. It is very timely, but I think it transcends timeliness. And I don't mean this, I mean this as sincerely as possible, really. I think it's a classic. I do. I think it has all of the hallmarks of a classic, of a book that's going to outlast its time, just in the way, and that despite looking back on it and pointing out some of the things you point out, the same way that Jules Verne novels were classics, that lasted, for 100 years, that have really meant something to people and inspired people, and envisioned a future wherein parts of it are, really happened and some parts didn't, obviously, but there is a classic element to it that transcends its era. And this has all of those elements. And I think part of it is because part of it is based in reality. Part of it is based in real experience and the experience of your wife and the experience of your children and the authenticity of that. But it also transcends that, the just simple, that kind of um personal, experience. It transcends it. It becomes something altogether richer and more universal, because it speaks about the experience of a lot of people. And it also points, in so many ways to where we are, but also where that could lead, and the frightening aspects of where that could lead. And I do want to make clear to anybody who's listening to this that this book, though, is an adventure story. It's not a polemic. It's not a political polemic. It's more than anything, it's an adventure story that carries you along the way great adventure stories always do. You get involved with the characters, so, like right from the beginning, you're caught up in their story. And I don't know what kind of magic you wove to do that. But right from the moment, it just you're brought along with it, and there's a momentum to it, like all great adventure stories have. Um,
I always say one thing when people ask me, do I have like a strategy for writing comics?
mhm,
And that is just a piece of advice that I got from an interview with Carl Barks, the
mhm,
great, I mean, my favorite cartoonist of all time,
mhm,
but the great duck artist. And they said, "What's your philosophy, or what when you sit down to write a page of comics, what are you trying to do?" And he said, "First and foremost, I want to end every single page with a little piece of upbeat business because I want them to turn the page,"
mhm.
which is something you would never think about in prose. You
Yeah.
might think in terms of chapters,
Yes.
or you might think in terms of the overall kind of like global quality of the narrative driving forward. But in comics, you do think about pages,
Yes.
at least printed comics.
Yeah.
Of course, it's different online, but I, when I first was working on the Moon Prince, you already had like the phenomenon of web comics well established, and
Hmm.
the idea of the infinite scroll.
Yeah.
And you were starting to see more and more of just like a bunch of stacked horizontal panels that
Hmm.
people would scroll down through. Um, but I would post a page a week,
Yes.
and that page was designed to be printed.
Hmm.
Um, and I remember thinking, I want each of those pages to end with something that drives the narrative forward, because it's got to, in this case, it's not even what Karl Barks was up against, which was, do they flip the page to the next page? In this case, it was, do they come back in a week
Yes.
to see what happened next?
Hmm.
And the other thing is that I wanted it to be dense in terms of the story in a way that books are, prose books,
Hmm. Hmm.
um, and not just, as is often the case with comics, where it's episodic to the point of being like picaresque,
Hmm.
you know, where it's like, then this little unit of 20 pages happens. And
Hmm.
then that next little story arc of 20 or 30 pages happens. I was thinking to myself, okay, so given that I'm just going to do this thing and support myself with my day job, is there a kind of long ass narrative that you could come up with in comics that's maybe not typically been the case, that
Hmm.
hasn't really been feasible before because of the dynamics of what you've got to do, let's say, a monthly story or a bi-monthly story. And then later you can go back to it and say, okay, well, it turned out that this was a 1,500-page story I did, you know. But then if you look at it, you can still see the seams, In science fiction, they used to call them fix-up novels
Hmm.
because science fiction had this tradition of working with serialized novellas
Right.
or longer short stories. And
Yeah.
then if you had some narrative thread connecting them together, publishers would say, can we turn this into a novel? And they would call it a fix-up novel. So it'd be 150 pages, but it would be built out of 50-page or 40-page chunks stitched together.
Right.
Comics, even more so, because the serialization would be 20 pages, 15 pages, and you, in the end, you could say, well, it's like Cerebus the Aardvark, right? It's like
Yeah.
it's 3,000 pages.
Right.
But Cerebus the Aardvark, um, you can still sense, pretty significant structural changes to the narrative that take place. And in particular, it starts off one way because it wasn't intended to be a single narrative in the beginning.
Right.
So it starts off more episodic. And then the longer that series went on, the longer you could see these arcs that were starting to come in and be planned for.
Yes.
So it was still at the whims of a production schedule that went around whatever Dave Sim was doing, bi-monthly or something like that.
Hmm.
Um, but he was struggling against it. He was trying to come up with like a coherent single story in long form. Or Bone, Geoff
Yeah.
Smith,
Yeah.
similar situation. He was trying to have a bigger narrative that all of these smaller narratives could fit in,
Sure.
but he was still like Charles Dickens writing in the 19th century and having his stories published in periodicals.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I was thinking simultaneously about, can I do a really coherent long story that was written from the get-go to be a long story with that in mind? So there's words that are spoken on page 2 that become important on page 400.
It's yes. And
And
that's obvious in the book too.
and at the same time, keep people turning the page because it's comics.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm hoping that was the case.
It
But
is.
that was, whether I succeeded or failed, that's what I was hoping to do, was have like a dense narrative structure where there were like a bunch of threads running through 400 pages simultaneously,
Hmm.
and characters, wandering off and going off in this direction, but the character that they were with is over here now doing this, and then hopefully it's possible to tie all that together.
Well,
And
it, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
I was just going to say you aspire, I think, in a case like that to the kind of the epic, the Tolkien-esque thing, where it's like Sam and Frodo are off here, and the rest of them are over here doing
Yeah.
something different, and hopefully those things tie together.
Yeah. Yes. And you get the sense in what I'm reading here is exactly that. Um, is that you don't get the sense that this is episodic in the sense of, you're inventing it as you go along. You get the sense that this is all worked out. These threads are all going to come together or overlap in some way that's very um everything seems to be have a certain level of importance. And all of you also sense that there's a backstory to all these characters um that you've thought about and you've established in your mind. So when I'm reading this, there's an authenticity to all of these characters and all these situations. Like the story of the moon as you arrive on the moon as a reader, and the moon unfolds, and the structure of the society there, and the various rivalries that are going on between, the bat race or whatever, and the Grus and etc. All of that it doesn't feel just like happenstance. It feels like there's an existing planetary structure there that exists, and you get the sense that there's an established history there, and that we're becoming gradually aware of it. But I don't get the feeling ever that you're just throwing that in there because this episode, or you needed something for a certain chapter of the story. It all feels like it's natural. So the intricacy, that interwoven quality really does exist. And it does, you know, create the feeling that this is a large tapestry, not a quilt.
And I don't think that that's like some kind of like rare ability to do that or something like that. I think it's an unusual circumstance to be able to have the kind of like narrative luxury of saying, I don't need to do this for a living right now, and
Mm.
I do have enough time, that I can carve out in a week to pull this off. So I will try to do. It's not just a 430-page story or whatever it is. It's really
Yeah,
a 1,200-page story if you count the rest of it.
yeah.
Going back to the original outlines from the get-go. But so doing something that long, I don't think it's like something that only this person or that person could do. I think it's just more weird and unusual to have the opportunity
Mhm.
to work in that way.
Yeah.
But I used to teach. Uh, teach is a strong word. We used to have a group of young kids in Jersey that my son belonged to, who wanted to do comics, and they would meet every week. There was a group of parents that had a space in their house in Jersey City where these kids, a group of like 10 or 12 kids, could meet every Saturday afternoon and just sit and draw comics.
Hmm.
And so Max was part of this
Hmm.
and loved it.
Yeah.
Very creative group of kids. But inevitably, I kind of wound up saying a few things here and there because I just happened to do comics anyway. And I was the only parent there that did.
Hmm.
And so uh, it evolved to the point where I would like talk a little bit at the beginning and give them some pointers or show them some stuff on the computer, et cetera, et cetera. And one day, there was one kid a young girl, maybe 10, who loved to draw.
Hmm.
And she drew what we used to call pinups back in the day,
Hmm.
not like pinup art with good girls or
Hmm.
whatever they used to call it back then, but pinups in the sense that comics used to do, where it was like a one-page drawing
Yes.
of a character, male or female, but it was just like a drawing you could cut out and pin up on your wall of
Hmm.
one of your favorite heroes, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So she liked that type of comics drawing, where she would just draw like a character and put a lot of work into it and not have a story going.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked her about it because the other kids were doing stories. I said, do you think you could do a story? And she said, no, I don't. I just don't. I'm not good at that. And so I thought, as an exercise, let's just try to tell a story verbally,
Mm-hmm.
because I remembered as a kid, my brother and I would tell each other stories because we shared a bedroom, and we would just as we were supposedly going to sleep, we would lie there and tell each other stories that we invented on the spot. And what I remembered from being a kid was that you never ran out of story. It
Yeah.
was just it was just this thing, like it just kept one thing led to another.
Mm-hmm.
And then sometimes you would reincorporate something from a week ago would come back up. And I remember thinking, I don't know how this is working, but it seems to just work with almost effortlessly. And it's not something that we normally do anymore, but I suspected that it was something that was kind of innate, or went back millennia to a time when we spent a lot more time sitting around in the
Yeah.
dark, keeping each other
Yeah. Yeah.
occupied.
Yeah.
So I said to this girl, I said, well, what do you think if you don't have to draw this or write it out or go to all this trouble. I know you like drawing a single page, but now you've drawn this character. Where are they from?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What do you think? And she opened her mouth and talked for 25 minutes and told a story.
Yes.
And every time she started to slow down, I would just like, which didn't happen that often, but a couple of times she started to slow down and maybe became self-conscious. And I would be like, well, and why did that happen? Why did they do that? Or what was this person thinking? Like, I don't understand why that would happen. And then she would go, oh, wow, well. And then she would open her mouth and more would come out. And it was like one of those magic tricks where you just keep pulling the scarf out
Yeah.
of the sleeve and it's endless. And that I think it would be absolutely feasible and possible for people to sit around doing
Mm-hmm.
800-page or 1,000-page comic books if they had a chance
If they had a chance, yeah.
and have that kind of density and that kind of narrative.
Yeah.
But I don't, when has that ever been possible? I don't think too
Yeah.
often. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad that you've had that chance because this book is a wonderful book. And I really hope anybody listening to the show goes out and gets it because Moon Prince is just a terrific achievement, 17 years in the making. And just a wonderful, wonderful story. And you can tell from the cover, not only is it a wonderful story, but it's a beautiful book as well, beautifully rendered, beautifully colored. And just it really, as somebody who's known you for a long time, I'm so gratified to see this book achieve the success it has. And I hope that libraries everywhere will pick it up and people will just indulge in it and love it as
Well,
much
it
as
got
I
it
do.
got the publisher's weekly reviews, so that's
Yeah.
like
It was great.
that's very important from the library market
Yes, it is.
perspective.
Absolutely it is. And I think that's fantastic. I also hope to see it, I think this is a great property. I think that it won't be long before there are offers at your door for a movie or for a series. I think that would be great to see. It's been 2 hours and I can't believe it's been 2 hours because it's gone by like that. I hope we get to do this again sometime real soon.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Always a pleasure.
Yeah.
And we could go on.
Oh,
So
yeah.
another time we will.
Kevin, it's been great to have you on the show. Thanks for being here, man.
Thanks, Geoff. A real pleasure and glad to be back because it's, I think, my second appearance on your
Yeah.
podcast.
Yes, it
Yeah.
is. Yeah, it is. And hopefully there will be many more in the future. Okay, so there you go. I hope you enjoyed that long, very long and wide-ranging interview. We talk about a lot of different stuff there, and I hope you found it engaging and of interest. Kevin is one interesting fellow with really insights into a lot of different things. So I know I picked up a few insights myself during that interview, and I hope that you found it equally engaging. So as I said before, I'm going to keep this short. I just want to let you know I've got a piece in Don Simpson's Megaton Man Multimensions, which just came out from Cosmic Lion Productions, and it's this big, great, oversized book featuring all of the characters from Don's wonderful Bizarre Heroes world from the Megaton Man universe. And I got a chance to work on the Asp and Dr. Messiah and introduce my character, Daiquiri Jones, into the mix. So I've got 4 pages in there amongst some incredibly diverse and talented creators who have all come together to celebrate Don's terrific creations. And it's a wonderful book. Maybe I'll get Don onto the show at some point. So I hope you'll look for it. It's called Megaton Man Multimensions. Just kind of Google it, go to Cosmic Lion. You'll find it there. I hope your comic shop has ordered a copy. And I know that there are folks traveling around cons selling copies, those who are included in the book. And I know Don's out there too. So be on the lookout, okay, for Don Simpson, and pick up Megaton Man Multimensions. It's a great, terrific collection of a lot of fun stuff, and all in full color, all oversized. I think it's like almost 10 by 16 or something like that. So it's a really big book, and over 200 pages. So really thrilling to be a part of that. I continue to work on my upcoming graphic novel, prose novel, Nice Work, which is available on Substack, and you can find it there. In the show notes, there'll be a link. And what else is going on? I think that's about it for now. So without further ado, as I said before, I'm going to cut this a little bit short. But as always, folks, it's been great to have you here, and thanks for listening.